So before we dive into today's topics, I want to kind of remind us where we were, kind of do a quick recap of where we've been. Last week we talked about Martin Luther and the beginning of the Reformation. So on October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of the Catholic Church in Wittenberg, Germany, and the Reformation begins. He probably didn't actually nail it. He probably had like his assistant do it, because that's how that works. But anyway, it's better if you give him the mallet and he's all dramatically nailing the theses. So the Reformation begins after this point. It catches fire. Luther kind of becomes this folk hero, this German folk hero, and kind of pushes these ideas. This was encouraged because the printing press was invented just 50 years before this. And so Luther writes a lot of things, and a lot of his work gets printed and gets disseminated all around Germany, all around Europe, and his ideas are out there. So his writing hit with people. And other people were feeling the same kind of things that he was feeling, right? It hit a chord with people. So these ideas spread, they increase, they grow. And because the Reformation was not just Luther alone, right? It's not just one guy yelling into the void here. Luther said something that a lot of other people were feeling and agreed with, and so they took it and ran with it themselves. And today we're going to kind of talk about those people and the different ways the Reformation hit in different places. Right? Germany was really dominated by Luther and his people and his crowd, but we're going to talk about different places. Next week we're going to talk about the Reformation in England and how that affects, but today we're kind of talking about the rest of Europe, specifically focusing on Switzerland. But the Reformation hit differently in different places. So first, let's talk about the Radical Reformation. The first kind of different aspect, different kind of way the Reformation hit that is different than Luther, right, was the Reformers kind of gave rise to this Radical Reformation. While Luther was a fiery writer, he was passionate, he could be aggressive, mean even in his writings, he was not one for rebellion, right? He was against violence. He wanted orderliness, right? He was a relatively conservative person in terms of practice, even though his words were very impassioned. So he was part of what we call the magisterial reformers, which were against the radical reformers. So these radical reformers, the magisterial reformers were traditional, right? They wanted to continue the kind of place that the church had in society, right? Kind of continue how the church was functioning, was running, but with different theology, right? He had a problem with corruption and the theology of the Catholic Church, not necessarily what they were doing, how they existed, right? He wanted to kind of maintain this traditional relationship between the church and the state authorities, and kind of just replace the Catholic Church in that sphere. Whereas the radical reformers kind of saw this government intervention in the church as a form of corruption, right? They didn't want the government kind of having oversight over the church. They kind of wanted to separate. And so they wanted to have their own kind of church. They didn't want it corrupted by outside influences. And so they were also more radical in their kind of actions. So what we have to start is have the magisterial reformers who want a new Protestant church that basically takes the place of the Catholic Church in government-church relationships. And the radical reformers didn't want government involved. They wanted autonomy. And unsurprisingly, these radical reformers had a lot of support with the poor and the peasant class who were kind of, oppressed. Right? The government, the church kind of kept them down, a lot of severe taxation, all of these different things. So they kind of saw in Luther this pushing against the powers that be. Right? It's like kind of a fight the power type situation. Right? So they took the Reformation even further. Right? They wanted to take extreme action. They wanted to fight to kind of overcome these oppressive forces that they saw. That wasn't exclusively, but that was a part of the radical reformers. This kind of all leads, and Luther's trying to kind of keep the peace, right? He's kind of like, hey, let's not kill people and fight and do all this stuff. And the radical reformers are like, no, we need to overthrow the system kind of a thing. So this led to some problems. The most prominent one was the Peasants' War in 1520. Peasants' War in 1520. And that's just, right, a couple of years after the Reformation started. So this starts, right, kind of a fervor starts to happen. And basically this is just a rebellion, right? A rebellion from radical reformers, from peasants who wanted to kind of take back and stop the oppression that they were kind of feeling. But this is basically quelled by the government and put down. But there will be continued kind of these rebellions here and there going forward. And the radical reformers would stay around, right? Even though the Peasants' Rebellion is kind of put down, their ideas would kind of stay. They would kind of be around where they could be on the fringes of society. And the most prominent of these radical groups would be called the Anabaptists. Anabaptists. Anabaptists came to believe, based on the New Testament, that baptism should be for believers only. Right? They were called Anabaptists because ana, right here, means to re or again. Right? So as a re-baptizing or a baptizing again. Right? Because basically everyone had participation in the Catholic Church, Lutherans, everyone for several hundred years was baptized as infants, and so they were re-baptizing themselves after they had a conversion type experience happen. Right, so that's why they were labeled Anabaptists. So neither the mainstream reformers like Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, that we're going to talk about, or the Catholics liked the Anabaptists very much. Right, they were heavily persecuted. They saw what the Anabaptists were doing as kind of this fringe practice. Right, they'd gone too far. They'd gone too extreme. They were getting crazy. They were hysterical in their beliefs. Yeah, Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, all these guys, very, very against the Anabaptists. Right, the Anabaptists were not welcome. Right, they were exiled. They were killed by everybody, Catholics, reformers alike. So they were not welcome. And there's this whole thing where the Anabaptists take over the city, and it's this whole problem. We're not going to get into it, but there's several reasons, and they were kind of in people's face about it too. So they were kind of asking for it a lot of times. But anyway, so nobody liked the Anabaptists, and these radical reformers were kind of on the fringe, but they're there. They're hanging out. Right, so you can see it's not just Catholic versus Protestant that we have happen. Almost immediately we have like magisterial reformers versus radical reformers, and then we have German Lutherans versus like Swiss Zwinglians, and then all of them against Catholics, and back and forth. So all of these different groups start to kind of pop up almost immediately, right, and start fighting against each other. From doctrine and persecuting each other. Whoever's in charge kind of persecutes the other people, all this type of problems. And then the government gets involved. It's this whole thing. So not a great time necessarily for that sorts of things. And remember, we're still kind of coming out of the Middle Ages too, so governments are not super strong. One strong leader of a city, of an area, can just basically be the king of that area, right? If you are friends, like Luther was friends with a local head guy, so he kind of could do what he wanted, right? So he had some power that way, so he was kind of in. But if you weren't in with whoever's kind of in charge in that area, of that city, of that country part, then it got complicated, right? So it's not like one unified. Germany's not one thing. France is not one thing. They're all kind of separated into different areas, cities, regions. All right. I do want to note, Anabaptists are not actually related to Baptists, even though that's confusing. So we as Baptists, we're not Anabaptists, right? So Anabaptists come first. They kind of have their little thing, and then couple hundred years later, Baptists will show up. And they make it very clear when they first start, we are not them, because nobody likes Anabaptists. So they were like, we are not them. Right, so two distinct groups with different ideas, different theology, all that sort of thing. So we will get to Baptists, but not yet. Two different groups. All right, let's move and talk about Switzerland. So a little history on kind of Europe. They've been fighting back and forth. Germany and northern Italy are kind of one state called the Holy Roman Empire. France is kind of one of its own country. But during this time, Switzerland they have the best army around, right? They have this undefeatable type army. So they kind of create and kind of build this own country for themselves. Even though it's not one country, it's a bunch of different like cities that are all, it's called the Swiss Confederation. They kind of unite in these different cities to kind of have their own identity. So they have some independence, more independence than other cities in the area might have. And so there's this strong kind of Swiss nationalism and Swiss support. And so within that, we have this growth of a new type of Reformation. And it's led by one main guy originally, Ulrich Zwingli. And he's Swiss, born in 1484. He was roughly in the same generation as Luther, so they're kind of contemporaries of each other. They would talk and argue. He became a priest in 1506. Soon after, he would kind of dive into the scripture. And so he kind of has, independently of Luther, because they didn't really know each other at this point, right? They live hundreds of miles away. He kind of independently came to similar conclusions that Luther was coming through at the same time, right? And so he was kind of in that same ideas in the same sphere, heavily influenced by guys like Wycliffe and Hus, which we talked about before, kind of pre-reformers, heavily influenced by those guys. And then when kind of Luther drops his theses in 1517, obviously hears about it, and he's influenced by that as well. So he has problems with corruption in the church, problems with a lot of things in the church he sees as being wrong. And so he starts teaching the Bible to people, right? Kind of early 1500s, he starts teaching the Bible to people. The date we have for the beginning of the Swiss Reformation that Zwingli would champion is New Year's Day on 1519. So on New Year's Day, 1519, a couple years after Luther posted his theses, Zwingli starts to preach a popular series on Matthew. Right? He was already a very popular preacher in his town of Zurich in Switzerland. But he starts this new series on Matthew, and what he does is he does what we call expositional preaching. Expositional preaching. Right? This is not something anyone was doing at the time. So he took the Bible, he started in Matthew 1, and he preached the genealogies in Matthew 1. And people just didn't do that at that time. And then he just kept preaching, verse by verse, line by line, preaching the Bible and the Gospel of Matthew. And this hit, right? This was not a usual thing to do. Nobody was doing it. He's the first one to kind of do this thing in his area, right? So people are standing and hearing already this popular preacher start preaching the scripture in their language in a way they can understand, right? He's not preaching in Latin. He's giving it to the people, right? All of these Reformation ideas we're talking about, right? The scripture given to the people, just like Luther. Same ideas here. Zwingli and Zurich will kind of then slowly start to move away from the Catholic Church. In 1522, Zwingli would resign from the priesthood and remove himself from the Catholic Church. And then the city of Zurich would hire him, the city council would hire him to be the city's official preacher. Right? So he would basically become kind of the bishop of Zurich at this point. Right? He becomes kind of the de facto spiritual leader, this kind of the mayor of Zurich, very powerful and influential in his city. Right? So he does his thing. Right? He kind of takes over, starts preaching through the Gospels, through the Scriptures, and gains a lot of power, leaves the Catholic Church. Eventually, Zurich itself would leave the church based off Zwingli's kind of influence. And what he was doing, his stances were kind of the same as Luther, right? All these Reformation ideas. Salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, based on Scripture alone, to the glory of God alone. So the solas, we say, in the Reformation, right? These ideas, he was all in line with these ideas. He particularly had a thing against idolatry. That was his thing, where Luther was works and grace, right? He's like, don't do works, it's all about grace. These two things that Luther saw. Zwingli was all about anti-idolatry. And he saw that as the greatest problem facing humanity, facing the church, was this idolatry. And so the core of all the Roman errors, all the Roman problems that he saw was idolatry, right? So he was on this quest against idolatry in the church. And this led him to a bunch of different places. It led him to seek the Scriptures, right? But also led him to be very anti kind of relics, icons, images, sculptures, and paintings. He would remove all of these things from the Catholic Church, all the paintings and the sculptures and the filigree and all the fanciness, right? He would take out of his churches in Zurich. People would complain. We have a letter of a Catholic writing to the emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, saying how there's no longer churches in Zurich, they're just stables, right? Because they're just plain and flat. There's no like fancy art, right? It's just clean. He removes all of that because he sees it as idolatry, right? Worshipping something that's not God. He wants the idea of the transcendent living God to be at the forefront of his mind, right? So that's one of the key things that he does. Now, though Zwingli and Luther would agree on many things, grace alone, scripture alone, that kind of stuff, they would argue, right? They had some problems. And one of the key debates they had was over the Lord's Supper, So we're going to talk about that a little bit. The three kind of stances. So the Catholic view on the Lord's Supper we call transubstantiation. Hopefully that's spelled correctly. Transubstantiation. And what this holds to is that sometime when you take the elements, the bread and the wine, and when the priest blesses them, it transforms into literal body and blood of Christ, right? Literal, the actual body and blood, right? So it's some kind of miraculous event that happens, and it transforms. And that's the Catholic doctrine of the Lord's Supper, transubstantiation. Well, Luther and Zwingli both reject this idea, right? They say, no, that's not what happens, right? That's not what happens. Now, Luther, though, doesn't want to go too far away from this, right? So he says it's not literally body and blood, but he wants to say that the real presence of Christ is in the elements. This real presence is what the term he uses. And he doesn't really define it, right? He just wants to say the real presence of Christ is there, and he doesn't know how or why. It's some miraculous thing where the presence of Christ is in the elements. Right. Sometimes referred to as consubstantiation, con being with, so together. Instead of transforming, it's with, even though that's not really a word Luther used, but that's kind of how we have defined it, consubstantiation. Anyway, it's the real presence. Now, Zwingli, on the other hand, rejected that. And he wanted to just say that in communion, it is a symbol of remembrance, right? It is a memorial, right? It's a picture, and that's it. That's all that it is. It's just a metaphor, just a symbol. Right? It just reminds us of what Christ did, who he is, and all that thing. Right? So that's the kind of the Zwingli stance. So Luther and Zwingli, though they agreed on a lot of things, this was a big sticking point for them. They would actually meet in 1529 to try to come to an agreement, try to bring the Reformation together, unify, strengthen numbers, that kind of idea. But they couldn't come together. Right? They disagreed too much on the stance. And so after this, they were kind of enemies before, but they kind of became real enemies after this, right? Luther wrote a lot of very hateful things against Zwingli and vice versa, right? So they were not friends at this point. Very heated over this idea of communion and the two stances. So not long after this, in 1531, Zwingli would die. He was actually he was like a Swiss nationalist, right? He was very pro-Swiss. He was the chaplain of the army in Zurich and a soldier, so he was fine with taking up arms, defending, fighting, all that sorts of stuff. And so he would actually die after in the battlefield. There's this whole thing where he was trying to put a blockade against some of the other Swiss cities so they would convert to Reformation ideals instead of Catholicism, and they didn't like that, so they attacked Zurich. It was this back and forth, right? So there's this political intrigue and movements happening back and forth. But he dies in this battle in 1533. And he wasn't that old at this point, but he dies fairly young in this battle. So another guy takes over for him. Bullinger takes over for Zwingli in Zurich. And Bullinger had been a student of Zwingli. So he just carries on Zwingli's ideals. Right? And he's around in Zurich for many years, 40 years. He's very influential. Him and Calvin would get along very well, and they would kind of codify this Swiss Reformation together later on. So that's Bullinger. All right, let's see. All right. So I do want to note that this movement last week, I misspoke. Sonda had a question I want to clarify. Last week, this movement in Switzerland with Zwingli and Calvin and Bollinger would start to be called the Reformed Church, and they would use this idea of Reformed. Last week, I mistakenly said something, but I want to clarify. These Reformed churches identify the Swiss Reformation churches, right? So the Zwingli, the Calvin, the Bollinger, this would be kind of labeled as Reformed versus Lutheran. Right, so that would be the differences. And those would be kind of the two main sects of the Reformation before we get to England. But those would kind of be the two main ones. So this Zwingli-Luther divide that we had seen between a number of things, but mostly this communion, would stay and be the Reformed Lutheran divide. And that's kind of, we still see that today. Right, so Lutherans are different than kind of this Swiss Reformed Calvin kind of descendant that we see. Okay, I think that's all. Questions, thoughts, comments on Zwingli? Yes? The podcast Here We Stand? No. I know John mentioned that the Gospel Coalition is doing a series of lessons.
So Here We Stand, it was Desiring God,
Mm-hmm.
It's like 10, is that the one you're talking about? It's like 10 minutes.
Okay. Yes, that's what you were talking about.
I'm away from it, and I listen to that. But okay.
So yeah, yes, there is some like excerpts about some history on all of these reformers that they're doing right now. Here I Stand. I didn't know the title, but yeah, Here I Stand is kind of the name of it. Here We Stand. You can find it if you search for it online. But yeah, I listened to the first couple, the Luther one and another one, and they're pretty good. So I recommend them. But yeah, thank you. Good resource. If you want to dive further into Zwingli or any of the people that we're talking about, that's helpful. Yes, sir. What is Bollinger known for? So he just carries on Zwingli's ideas. So he just does Zwingli's idea. Him and Calvin get together and they have a confession, Reformed confession, and he's the one that writes it. And so that's kind of his claim to fame. So he does that. But he just is a popular leader. He champions Reformed theology. He continues on this kind of the Reformed city of Zurich through all the ups and downs and policies and problems and that kind of thing. So he's more just a leader and a writer. He's not as impactful, as innovative as Zwingli is. So still very important, but not as innovative. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. Let's move and talk about probably the most influential guy in Switzerland, John Calvin. John Calvin. So Calvin, born in 1509. So he's kind of the generation after Luther. Even as a kid in France, he's French. John Calvin is French. Even as a kid, he was very religious. He would go to school. He'd be to train as a lawyer, but he decides to kind of pivot into religious study, heavily influenced by Erasmus, Hus, these similar guys, these humanists that kind of are going back to the original text. Want to kind of read early church fathers, Augustine, and all these guys. And so he's very influenced by all this kind of stuff that's going on, Luther, all of these things. At one point in his study, he has kind of this conversion experience when he's young. And from then, he starts having very strong Protestant sympathies. But this is a problem in France, because France is still a Catholic nation, overwhelmingly. So he gets a warrant for his arrest, and so he flees to a town in Basel, Switzerland. He's there for a little while, and then on the way, he's trying to get back to Strasbourg, France. But on the way, he stops in Geneva, and a friend kind of guilts him into staying in Geneva and helping him kind of proclaim the gospel and fight for this reformed ideology. So he's there in Geneva with his friend, preaching and teaching and doing all this stuff. They would kind of fight the city government over punishment for sinners. And so they were eventually expelled from Geneva. They were told to leave, kicked out. And for 3 years, he's in Strasbourg, where he originally was trying to get to. And he stays there, he gets married, hangs out. Calvin was he was a scholar, right? He was a scholar, he was a teacher. He wasn't as fiery or as aggressive He wasn't as aggressive as Zwingli or as fiery as Luther. He was mostly just, he wanted to study. That was his main thing. That was what he wanted to do. Geneva then eventually calls him back about 3 years later, and he starts teaching, right? And he's just the main preacher guy. He started preaching, teaching. He preaches a ton, 2, 3, 4 times a week. He preaches, does a lot of study, writes a lot of books, all that sort of stuff. Now, Calvin under Geneva, the city of Geneva in Switzerland, under Calvin's kind of pastorate, it becomes kind of, Switzerland is in this place where every citizen is kind of under the moral law of the church, right? So the moral law and the civil law, the church law and the government law are kind of one thing, right? So there's this like one kind of, so you could like sin something, whatever it may be, not take communion or whatever, and you would go to jail for that sort of stuff. Right, so similar kind of ideas. So and Zwingli kind of ran Zurich the same way, right? It was like this iron fist of church law is city law, right? So Calvin was less militant than Zwingli, obviously. He wasn't in the army and stuff, but he was more casual about it. But he was a dominant figure of the city and influenced education and commerce and laws and practices and all kind of stuff in Geneva, right? He kind of becomes the pseudo leader of there, even though he's not technically on the city council or whatever, they kind of, if he was like, hey, do this, they would do it, right? So he's very popular, very influential in the city. And Geneva would actually become this like haven for reformers. So if you were Protestant, you were stuck in France or Italy or someplace where they didn't like Protestants, lots of people coming to Geneva to study, to study under Calvin, for safety, for training, all those sorts of things. So a lot of people all over Europe. John Knox, who was a Scot from Scotland, would seek refuge in Geneva during his time when he got kicked out of England. So that kind of thing. Very popular during this time. Calvin, well known for his preaching and writing. His most popular, famous work is his systematic theology, which is called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. The title is actually like 5 sentences long, but we just shorten it to The Institute. They liked that at that time, just giant titles. But Institutes of the Christian Religion. It is a seminal text, like one of the most important texts written in the history of the church. He released the first version in 1535 when he was just like 26, and he would continue adding to it kind of most of his life. So he would add and edit and kind of move things around for most of his life. And so he would work on that for 20, 30 years. He would also work with Bullinger in Zurich to kind of unify this reformed kind of church position, and they would come together, and Swiss would be kind of this reformed area. Switzerland would be. He mostly concerning kind of highlights of, we're not going to get into Calvin too much in terms of theology, but you can go very, very deep, right? He's one of the most well-known theologians, systematic theologians in church history. But sovereignty of God is super important to him, centrality of the gospel, and the preaching of the word. Those are kind of the highlights for Calvin. Something I do want to point out, as we've been talking about a ton, is how the church and the government relate. And we've talked about that a ton, but we want to talk about it again, right? Where Luther kind of wanted to maintain these two relationships, he saw two worlds, right? There's a church world and a government world, and they interact and kind of go back and forth, but the government does its job and the church does its job. That's kind of Luther's idea of how those things should work. The radical reformers, on the other hand, were like, no, the church does what it wants and shouldn't have input from the government, right? Because that's corruption. They wanted autonomy, basically. And then the Swiss, under Zwingli and Calvin, those guys, were like, no, they're like one thing, right? So the church is kind of in charge, moral law and civil law, kind of one thing, right? And there's a lot of kind of accounts of people who were preaching, whether anabaptist preaching in Switzerland or non-Trinitarian preaching in Switzerland, and those people would be exiled, they would be killed. There was like that kind of thing was a kind of government civil law you could not do, right? So you would face civil punishment for those kind of things. Okay. So that's kind of where we stand in those regards. Persecutions are happening, right? At this time, Protestants persecuting Catholics, Catholics persecuting Protestants, radical reformers persecuted by everybody. So that's kind of how that works. All right. That is Calvin. Questions on Calvin? We could get super in depth, but yes. We'll say, go ahead. Tulip? We could talk about that. So that was actually a codification of Calvin's ideals from his opponents up probably 100 years later after his time. And then they codified it as like, oh, these are the points of distinctions of Calvin and his teachings after he was dead. And kind of, his opponents are like, this is what you were talking about. And so Arminius, who is kind of the guy that, the name kind of codifies this, and he kind of has 5 counterpoints, right? So that's kind of where that comes from. So it's just, he didn't come up with that. It's just someone simplifying his doctrine, essentially. So yeah. Anyway. But very, very influential, right? Reformed theology, very influential, spreads all over the place, spreads to England, all over Europe. Very, very influential because it became this kind of place to go, place to study, this refuge, right? People would go and study and then take that other places. Okay. Any other thoughts, Calvin? Okay. Let's talk about the counter-reformation. How did Catholics respond to this process? What was going on with the Catholics here? I want to consider kind of a few responses. The first response is persecution. All right, persecution of Protestants. The most extreme of these is the Inquisitions. We've heard of this. The Spanish Inquisition being the most harsh, most notable and violent. In the late 1400s, so this is before Luther, right? The Spanish Inquisition starts, and this is mostly due to the nature of Spain and where they were at. Spain had been fighting the Muslims for many hundreds of years. The Christians and the Muslims were fighting in Spain for a long, long time. And so finally, in 1492, the Christians kind of drive out Spain, the Moors, the Muslims, from Spain. Right? So they finally have control over the whole peninsula in 1492. Yes, that's Columbus year. Connected. So the Inquisition is kind of starts then, around this time, right, to kind of basically to push out Muslims, essentially, right? It's this, we want to clear the Muslims out, right? So there's this Inquisition trying to seek out, find Muslims, expel them, prosecute them, force all these people that had been under Muslim rule for hundreds of years to kind of convert to Christianity, all this sorts of stuff. So there's this power battle happening. So when the Reformation happens in the Spanish area, right, and there's these new ideas kind of coming, they just kind of add Protestants to the list, right? That Muslims are on the list, Jews are on the list, and now Protestants are on the list, right? So that's kind of what happens there. In France, there's persecution against Protestants. We won't get into them. The Huguenots basically get destroyed and all this stuff. But so there's persecution against Protestants all over kind of Catholic areas, as you might expect. And there's persecution of Catholics from the Protestants too. So anyway, but that's one way the Catholic Church responds, right? There's imprisonment, there's executions, there's forced conversions. All this stuff is happening. And to varying degrees in different places, right? Depending on who's in charge, more severe than other places. So that's one response the Catholics have, right? Persecution. Another response was with theology and with reform itself. So beginning about 1540 and ending about 1560s, we have the Council of Trent. So this is a council, a series of meetings that happen in Trent over about 20 years, where the Catholic Church kind of does a lot of things. The first and most important thing they do, they denounce Protestants, right? Of course, right? And they stand and reaffirm all those Catholic doctrines that the Protestants are against, transubstantiation, the Pope, all these things, all their standard practices that they've been doing. Next, they formalize and standardize the Latin Mass. Right, they formalize the Mass. And this would last until the 20th century. So from 1540, 1560s, would last until the Vatican II, basically in the 1960s. Right, so this is very relevant. So the Latin Mass is codified, it's standardized, in an effort to unify the church. Right, so France and Italy can we're doing the same things. Right, France is not going off there doing something weird. Right, we want to do the same stuff. Right, so they kind of unify the church in that way. And then, most importantly, they push for reform, right? So the counter-reformation has reform itself, right? So Pius V kind of takes control in the 1560s as Pope, and he's a very devout person, right? He wants to return. He recognizes all the problems that the priesthood and the leadership have had for the last Middle Ages, and the moral failings. and he wants to change it, right? So his push is for more piety, more devotion, right? How do we have more devotion? How do we get the lay people to be more devoted? How do we encourage this kind of practices? And so they have reform, right? They have a lot of disciplinary action. They change, to try to eliminate a lot of the corruption, try to return to this kind of a true piety, right? A true piety, which is good, right? So there's a positives that happen because of the Protestant Reformation, even within the Catholic Church. All right, so that's the Council of Trent. Super important. A lot of stuff happens there, but those are the kind of the overviews. Now, another huge thing that was happening in the Catholic Church at this particular time was a move towards missions, right? Missionary work. The Jesuits, which is a sect of the Catholic Church, get started right around this time, and their push is to expand, right? To spread the gospel, to spread and extend the church to other areas, right? This is right around the time of the Age of Exploration, right? So Spain and Portugal are going to the New World. They're going to Africa. They're going to India. They're traveling all over the place. And so different people in the church see this as an avenue to kind of expand the church, right? To bring the gospel to the heathens, essentially. That's the idea. Now, this is big because no one was really doing this at this time, right? It had been a couple hundred years since the Crusades, and even then that wasn't really about, spreading the gospel and the church's ideals and Christ. That was about conquering a territory, right? So this idea is new at this time, right? We should do missions work. And so this is a really big, really impactful one. This will affect basically the whole, Jesuits are a big part of this, affect basically the whole world, right? Of spreading the church everywhere. Huge, huge impact. So that's another way the kind of church responds. It is quite rainy right now. The church responds to the Protestant Reformation. Okay. Any questions? Comments? We're all good. All right. Okay. Well, that's most of what I have for today. Went a little fast, I guess. And yeah. We'll see you next week. Next week, we're going to talk about the English Reformation. If you have any questions, come see me. I do want to recommend this book here. It's called What It Means to Be Protestant by Gavin Ortland. Michael lent this to me, but it's quite good. And it just talks about Protestantism and the core teachings and what it's about and why it's important and all that sorts of stuff. So yeah, I recommend that. I think there might be an extra one in the library, but I'm not sure. But yeah, so check that out if you want to keep moving. We're going to keep talking about what it means to be Protestant as we go along. We're going to move kind of away from Catholicism and move more toward Protestantism with the English Reformation. And we're kind of getting more specific to our own kind of stance. We're going to talk about Baptists and evangelicals and all that kind of stuff as the weeks come. So I'll try to get a little more world stuff, but we're going to focus in as we go. So thank you. I appreciate you all. Come see me if you have questions, and we'll see you next week.